So there are three main hooks in React. We talked about the two, use state and use effect, and we use those quite a lot in our scheduler app. But the third one we didn't talk about at all, use context. And that is also one of the big three of React, the triad, what's the word? The triumbria, something of React. Anyway, there are those three, and use context is a big one. And you'll see why in a second. And honestly, this is a life-changing experience. When I learned to use context, it's like, oh, are you kidding me? I'm using this everywhere now. Why would I even have done scheduler app that way? Well, we do it that way to learn or teach you how to use props, which can be annoying, right? Remember all those props going down? Oh, it changed names on you. Now keep going. It's like, oh, what's that? So that's props, right? And we'll talk about prop drilling in a second. So the context API removes that problem completely from the table and makes your life so much easier. So let's take a look. I'm going to do a quick screen share. Well, we'll see what we got, and I'll kind of describe a little more of what we're talking about here. So I've got this little app here that I wrote. Super simple little app. It's called My App because I couldn't think of a good name for it because it doesn't do anything. It has 2 pages. In fact, you look at my code, I made 2 pages. You could say it's a 2-page app. Of course, it's a React app, but it has 2 quote unquote pages. The first page is this login page. Not much to explain there. I have a counter on it though. Look at that. Okay, so I got a login page with a random counter I threw in. Okay, it lets me log in. I can type in anything, it doesn't matter. I can log in, and now I get a different page. So that's it. That's the whole app. Okay, there's nothing to it. 2 pages, there's an info page, and there's a login page. Okay, and if we take a look, I've got a little picture of it. It looks like this. There is my app. Nothing to it. I got an app, login page, or alternatively, I have an info page. Much like React Router would do for you, I can switch between one page and the other back and forth. And this is all done without React Router. And as I did mention before, you don't have to use React Router in your final project to get a multi-page app. It's not necessary. You can, but it adds a lot of complexity. And part of the complexity it adds is being able to pass props, because React Router can be a little more difficult to pass props between components. Okay, so there's my app. Okay, and I have my parent app login, and each of these 2 pages has a counter because what app isn't complete without a counter on it? And looking at my counter, so as you can see, I have a counter on my login page. There it is, login page counter. Okay, if I log in and click that, I get an info page which also has a counter in it. But it's a different counter. As you can see, this counter does not share anything with this counter. It went back to 0. So they're completely separate counters. And let's take a look at the counter. So there's nothing to it. I've got some state and some functions that let me change state, and I got my buttons and my counters. So nothing exciting happening here. Okay, so each of these counters has its own state, doesn't it? So this counter here has state, and then I switch to this page. This counter has state, and they are different. Okay, so in fact, if you take a look at it, looks like this, doesn't it? I have 2 counters, each with their own independent state. Well, what I want to do is I want to make them share state. I want them to have the same state. So when I increment one counter, and even if I switch pages, I should get the same number. I should get 9, which of course I don't at this time. Okay, so that's my goal, right? To have them share state, because right now they're not. Now, why? It's an academic exercise. I'm just making it work this way. So what would I have to do, knowing what we know about React, and I have these 2 components, what would I have to do traditionally to have these 2 components share the same state?
Raise the state up to the lowest common ancestor, which it would be the app component in this situation.
Exactly, yeah, the closest common ancestor. Sounds like vampires, doesn't it? Closest common ancestor. That's correct. That's exactly what we do. We do this. we'd put the counter state up to the closest common ancestor, and then we can share the state, can't we? So when I've done that, I've actually got a branch here. Let's go ahead and do that. I think I made a branch called, there, I called it prop drilling. There. So now what I've done is I've moved this counter state. Let's take a look at our app.js. There. Now my counter is, or my count is in my app.js, right? There's my count, and it's shared, it's passed down. So now I have state here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If I log in, great, I got a 5. I have shared state. Okay, I've achieved shared state. Perfect. So try again, let's change it here, 1, 2, 3, 4. Great, I am in fact sharing state, aren't I? This, and I'm sharing it the traditional way, right? I've pushed the state up to there. And of course, what I've had to do, of course, is I am then passing that state all the way down through each page to this, right? Let's take a look at the actual code for this. So I've got this, and there. So now I'm passing my login component. By the way, I'm simply using conditional rendering like this. Instead of using React Router, which is totally unnecessary for most apps, I'm simply doing this. I've got a flag and I show one page or the other. There's no magic happening here. So if the auth is true, it'll show info page. If the auth is not true, it renders the login page. Really simple, okay? And I'm passing this count down to my info, and inside my info page, which doesn't do much, I'm also passing this count down to the counter, right? And inside the counter, it gets props.count, and everyone's happy. Well, unless you have to code this thing, okay? So I'm passing my state all the way down. But not only that, right? That's not all I'm doing, is it? Because I'm passing the number. What else did I have to pass down besides the number? I want this counter to be able to do something, right? So I had to pass all the functions down as well, didn't I? Not only did I have to pass the counter down all the way, I had to pass the counter and all the functions that dealt with that counter. Well, now it's looking like a problem, isn't it? It's becoming much more complex. And this is the counter. This is nothing exciting, right? It's just a counter. So there's got to be a better way, right? Because as we can see, I am, it's my app, passing an awful lot of stuff that this info page doesn't care about. My info page, it doesn't use anything. It doesn't use any of that count or increment or clear, but it has to get it because it has to pass it along down to the counter. There we go. So this is called prop drilling. And what happens if I had a counter that was like 30 components down? I had all this, complex app, and I got a counter right at the bottom. Well, I have to be passing all this stuff all the way down. And we did that, didn't we, in the scheduler app, right? We passed lots of props all the way down. We did that on purpose to annoy you, okay? Actually, to teach you and annoy you, okay, about how to use props. But it wasn't an optimal way to do it, was it? It was a little complex and, hard to manage sometimes, like they change names. So this can be a problem. And as you can imagine, if I had a lot of stuff I'm passing around, I'm passing a whole bunch of stuff. Now, true, I could pass objects and do some other stuff, right? But still, it just seems like just a lot of work, doesn't it? Well, there's got to be a better way to make this thing happen. And it turns out there is. So instead of doing this, where I take my state up and I pass it all the way down and the functions to whoever needs it, and there could be hundreds of these, instead of that, I can use what's called a context. It looks like this. Ooh. Everyone impressed? This took me a lot of artwork to get this thing just shaded just right, okay? Using a context. And now, instead of passing stuff down, I'm simply wrapping my components in this nice warm blanket called a context. And of course, it's a context provider that provides that context. So I'm wrapping my components in this context, and now any component anywhere has direct access to this stuff without having to go through its parents. That's great. It's like getting your own credit card the first time when you're a kid. Haha. I didn't get one. Getting your first job. Yes, you can get money on your own without going through your parents. It's like, that's amazing. Or something like that. Bad analogy. Okay, so this is what I want. I want any child to get anything at once without having to ask its parents. There's a great goal, isn't it? Okay, so this is what we're going to accomplish. So right now I've got my prop drilling version here. So I'm going to switch back to my original branch. Let's go back here and I'll switch back. Hold on. There. There. I'm going to switch branches back to my original, which is right there. Now I have the original state, which is my non-shared state. Okay, let's go and do some things. So once again, I have my app and I have a login and I have my counters. So the first thing I'll do, because it turns out that context providers look an awful lot like custom hooks, like an awful lot. Like they're very, very similar to a custom hook. So let's make ourselves a custom hook. We're here, so make a hook. Make a hook. I'll make a file called use counter.js. We'll start off with a custom hook since we're here. Okay. And I'll make a function called function. I'll call it use counter. There. And I'll export this thing because I always forget that. Default use counter. Great. Okay. So there's my custom hook. Doesn't do anything right now. Okay. So as we know, in our scheduler app, we built two custom hooks, didn't we? One was easy. One was not so easy. Okay. The first hook we built was a bit of a pain, wasn't it? That use visual mode thing where we're transitioning and back and the mode is like, oh my gosh, that thing drove us crazy, right? And then there was a second hook, use application data, where all we had to do was simply copy and paste and voila, it works. That's what we're doing today. We're going to take all the stuff that we have in our counter right here. We're just going to copy that and put that inside our custom hook. Because really, at the end of the day, all a custom hook does is allows you to simplify the logic portion of a component. During your React lecture, they talk about the two parts of a component, the two main parts of a component. No? Oh, let's talk about that. It's pretty simple. There are two parts. There's the logic portion and the rendering portion. Here's the stuff that you do and the stuff that shows. So anything inside this return is the render part of the component. This is what gets displayed. We can call it the template, for lack of a better word. There's the template or render part of our component, and this is the logic part. I made that name up myself. Okay. Or we can call it the part before the render, but I like the word logic better. Okay. I tell people it's probably the best idea to do as much work as you can here. So all you have to do is simply render, like all this curly braces stuff. Try to avoid doing a lot of work inside the render part of your component. Like, although people do it, I have seen it done, like doing a map. Try to avoid doing a map in here. It just looks messy. And secondly, it distracts what you're rendering, right? You want to build your list here, make a list variable, and just say curly brace list, and it will expand your list. It's much more elegant. The analogy I use is think of like a Broadway play or just a play anywhere where you have your you hire your actors. They all learn their lines. You get your guys building all the sets. You got the light people getting things all ready. This is all stuff that happens before the show, right? Everyone's getting ready for the show. So that's this part. We're getting ready for the show. Everyone's getting ready. The actors are all getting, costumes on. The sets are all being assembled. And this, the return, that's showtime. The curtain rises and there's your stuff. Okay. That's what's going to have happen. You don't want to be building a set in the middle of your play. It's like the curtain rises and some guy's still banging on a hammer like, oh man, sorry, I'm almost done. Okay, go ahead. You want to get that stuff done before showtime. So where possible, do as much as you can before this. So do all your maps, all your stuff. You certainly can do it inside here, but just because you can doesn't mean you should. It's a much better practice to do it inside. Okay, so we know that we can abstract things. Abstraction just means make it simple. That's all. Okay, so we can abstract our component. We got a big long component. tons of stuff, lots of components. What would I do? Well, I'd simplify it. I'd make some subcomponents, right? I'd take a piece of this code and make that into a component. I could take this, maybe take this part here and make that a component, called it counter controls. Not really worth it here, but I could make this part even simpler, make a counter controls component, and then I simply have my counter and counter controls. Make it simpler. So I'm abstracting the complexity so it appears more simple at the level that I'm at. So that's why we have components. Otherwise, you've got an app with one big component. And I have seen applications with like everything's here, literally everything. So we try to abstract our code to make it simpler to read. Okay, so that's the component part. We can abstract this part, but what about the logic part? Well, that's where custom hooks come in. Custom hooks allow us to simplify or abstract away complexity in the logic part of our component. We can take this and put it inside a custom hook. So let's take that, we'll put this inside our use counter, just like that, and I'll do my use state because I need that, don't I? There. There we go. Okay, so now I have a function called use counter, and being a function, it has to return something, doesn't it? We know that. Custom hooks are probably should return. And we can decide what to return, usually either an array or an object. I think I'm going to return an object here this time, okay, with all this stuff, the counter, and then the functions that we need, increment, decrement, and clear. There. Okay, so now I'm returning those 4 things. And now any component that uses my custom hook has access to those 4 things, don't they? Easy enough. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's instead of go back to our counter, and now we'll take all the stuff away, and instead we're going to simply use the custom hook. This is old stuff, right? We're simply going to simplify this logic part. So let's grab this because this is kind of handy. There, let's take that there. And now we'll say that, we'll const that equals use counter. There it is. There. Okay. That's all. It's a custom hook, right? Okay. So now I've simplified this code by making a custom hook. It makes the code a little more readable. I've now put all those messy details of how a counter works. I've put them inside a custom hook. So any component that wants to can now use that. Now there's only one that's using it, but it certainly made my component much simpler as well. Okay. So does it still work? Yes, it does. It still does what it's supposed to do. Okay. So I'll log in, but unfortunately, as we know from our lecture on custom hooks, multiple instances of the same custom hook do not share state. It's still here, right? The state's still here. It's just now it's inside a function. So when I first learned about custom hooks, I thought, oh, great, I can share state. It's like, no, that was disappointing. No, they're still the same. There's no free lunch, okay? At least not with custom hooks. But they do make things simpler, right? That's much easier to read, okay? Well, turns out there is a free lunch, and it's called the Context API. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this custom hook and now modify it just slightly to turn it into something else. And once again, our goal is this, right? Our goal is to wrap our components in some kind of context so they can have access to in this case, the counter, okay? So how would I do that? Well, let's go ahead and make another folder called providers. And this is pretty common. You'll see it called providers, okay? And I'm actually going to copy this hook because this is so similar. I'm just going to copy the whole thing in there, okay? Now, our goal is to, of course, wrap our components. Where's my little picture? There. We want to wrap things. Now, to do that, we need to wrap our components here. Now, how can I wrap things? Now, that's kind of a markup term, isn't it? Wrapping things. So what I really want to do is have something that I can put here. Sometimes VS Code is a bit aggressive. Anybody found that out? It's like, it types stuff like, what the heck? Yeah, okay. I don't know. Okay, so As we can see, I have now wrapped these two components in this fragment. It doesn't do anything, but it's wrapping it. In other words, these two components are children of this fragment. That's what I mean by wrapping, right? So you can probably guess that a context provider is in fact a component. It is something I can put pointy brackets around. So that's what I'm going to make. I'm going to make a component, but it's a special kind of component called a context provider, and they're very cool. They're not that hard, but this is my goal. I'm going to wrap my two components, which is my login and my info, and by extension, their counters in this parent. So let's go to my provider, whichever, right there. I'm going to rename this to counter provider. Oftentimes you'll see the name provider. It's a very common pattern. It's a capital C because it is a component. Okay, so I'm going to rename this. I'm going to call this now counter provider, and I'll export that. Okay. Oh, hold on. Oh, I copied too much. Boy, VS Code is just so aggressive. Okay, there we go.
File name wrong.
I probably did too. Oh, you're right. Provides. Oh, yeah. Thank you for that heads up. Okay, awesome. Okay. So there, counter provider. Now it's a component. Well, not quite, because it's just a function. This is not yet a React component. And why is that? What's the definition of a React component? There's a very strict definition of a React component. So a React component is a function. Check. It's a function. But it's a function that does something very specific.
It's not rendering anything? There's no render?
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't return JSX. So yes, a React component is a JavaScript function that returns JSX. And this function just returns some object, so it's not. So I probably should just comment that for now and have my function return some JSX. I'll just put a fragment for now. There. Now it's a component. Voila! I've now made this into it is in fact now a React component, and I can use it as a component. And React will be happy. It doesn't render anything, and in fact, it renders exactly nothing. Okay. In fact, as we know, even fragments don't render, do they? So it is literally rendering nothing. But it's a component. It meets all the requirements of a React component. JavaScript function that returns JSX. Okay. So I want to turn this now into a provider, which is a slightly extra class of component that has a couple extra superpowers, but it's not hard to do. There's two steps to this. The first thing I want to do is I want to create a context. Okay, so I'm going to make a context. I make a variable called I'll call it my counter context. How's that? I'll call it my counter context. There. So my const, and I'll call it counter context. Context. There. It's a variable. I'm going to export this later. Equals, and I'm going to create this context. Now, it turns out that's pretty simple because there's a function in React called create context. There. Pretty simple. So we'll just import that. There. It's built into React. It's baked right in. So create context, okay? And by the way, what I'm doing here is all boilerplate. You can simply copy all this code and just change the image sandwich part and you're good to go. So I'll also be publishing this code exactly. So you'll have a copy of this very code with all the cool branches that show the evolution of the project. So you guys get everything you need. Okay. So create context. There, I've now created a counter context. I'm going to export that though, because I want other users to be able to import that so they can use it. All right. So that's the one line you add. You add one line and you have a context. Now, the only other thing you have to do is to now use that context as a component. And here's a bit of magic. It's not that bad. Unfortunately, you can just copy and paste this because it never changes. So you take your context, counter context. My counter context, it has a built-in component called provider. There. Okay. Slightly different, I'll admit. It's like, oh, what's that? But this never changes. Like literally, this code doesn't change. You can do this over and over again, okay? So there's that. So now I have a provider. This component now is a context provider just by doing this, okay? But the question is, what does it provide? It's a provider, but it doesn't provide anything yet. So we have to do one more thing so this provider will provide something, okay? And you probably guess is going to provide this stuff right here. In fact, let's just make this into a value instead. Const value equals there. Okay, so this is what the context is going to provide, those four things, to anyone who wants them. And to do that, we simply add one more parameter to this, which is value. Oops, value equals our value. There we go. And now we truly do have a pretty fully functional provider. It wasn't much. We added this one line there, this kind of funky thing here, and that's it. And now we have a context provider. It's like, what does that do for me? Well, we'll find out in a second. Turns out it's pretty cool. Okay, right? Okay, that's it. So this part here, all boilerplate. That part, all boilerplate. What you change is just this stuff there. That's all you have to add when you want to make a provider. This can stay the same. Okay, you don't need to change it at all. Okay, we have an almost functioning context provider. Okay, let's try and use our provider. Okay, we're going to wrap our app components in this new cool counter provider. So let's change this. I'm going to make this into instead counter provider. There. And we'll do the same thing here. There. Okay. Great. I have now wrapped my app in the counter provider. Anyone notice anything unusual has happened to me? I don't know. I can't see it. Someone point out to me. What's happened? I'm really stupid.
The whole thing just disappeared.
Yeah, my app's gone. Like, what the heck? My whole app disappeared on me. What happened? What happened here?
Is it because in the provider we didn't put like a children or something?
Oh
So
man, you're way ahead of me. Man, you're making this tough. Boy, okay. That's exactly right. If you look at my provider, it doesn't have any content. If I said hello in here, it would render hello. Because that's the component, right? The stuff inside here is irrelevant. It might as well not even be there, right? Because I'm simply calling this counter provider component, which could have whatever it wants in it, you know, hello world, right? Yeah, exactly. So what I want to have is, instead of having hello world, I want to have this stuff in here, don't I? And this is the content of that markup. This is markup. So this is the element, and this is the content of the element, right? In other words, these are the children of the element. So is there anything I can do here where I can get the children that I am wrapping here? And I'll give you a hint. We can use props, right? We have props. Now, as we know, there's a special prop. What's its name? Yes, props.children. That's exactly what props.children is made for, is doing stuff like this, where you can wrap stuff, have children, and then use it. We didn't use this at all during this scheduler app. I think we mentioned it in like the lecture maybe once and never used it. I think that's a shame because it's very cool. we just did things like this equals that, like a bunch of props, right? Like more and more stuff. When actual fact, we can just put stuff here instead, right? And not have to have a whole bunch of attributes. So it's a very powerful thing. So I can go props.children inside my provider, props.children. There we go. And it came back. Yes. Whew, what a relief. There, that's it. So now this is now a completely fully functional provider. This you don't change. That you don't change. You just change your functions and your value, and that's it. Dirt simple to write one of these things. And you can figure out what this does later, but really it's just use the provider thing. They are not hard to write. And turns out this is the hard part. We did all the hard stuff. The rest of the stuff is really, really easy to use the provider. So we've made a provider. Now we're going to use the provider. Okay. So how do we use it? Well, we wrapped our components in our provider. In other words, we've done this. We've now wrapped our components in this provider. And the context is now available to all these components. So what does that mean? How can I use that context? Use context. I don't know. There must be a way to use this context. So to use a context or make use of a provider, the following thing. We simply take any component you want, and it can be anywhere down the tree. It can be in login or any child of login or grandchild, great-grandchild, great-great-grandchild, great-great-uncle, third times removed, whatever. It doesn't matter as long as it's in the family tree, right? So any component in that family tree can do the following thing. I'm going to do an encounter just to demonstrate that we can bypass one of them, okay? So in counter, I'm going to change this to something else. I have to add one more line. I have to import, remember that thing we built in our provider? We had this thing, counter context. I have to import that. So in any component, I can import that counter context. There, that's it, just import it. And now I have a context, I want to use the context. So what React hook do you think we should use to use that context? It's not that hard, exactly. Use context, of course. We go use context, oops. Use context. And I'll just change this use context so I can import that. There we go. So use context takes one parameter. It takes the context. I should have said is undefined. I should have clued in, right? I made this big every time, okay? The context you want to use. So I want to use that context right there. There. Give it the context you want to use, and there. It's all happy again. But now I'm getting this a different way, aren't I? That's it, by the way. That's all I had to do. Add this one import and then use it. So to use a context, super simple, import the context and use it. And whatever that context exposes gets returned by the use context. In other words, those things there are exactly what I had here, okay? And you don't have to use all of them. It's an object. You can use one. In this case, I think I need them all. Yeah, I do. I need all of these at this point in time, so I need them all. So let's see if it still works. It does work. Look at that. And let's log in. It's still 9. I have achieved shared state. It's like I've achieved fusion, but this is better, okay? Stable state. That's not a good analogy. Anyway, I've got shared state. It's awesome, okay? When I first saw this, it was like, oh, are you kidding me? This is so awesome. And look, Ma, no props. There's no props. This is just, my counter is just pulling its state out of thin air. It's just like grabbed it with nothing. It's amazing. So I don't know about you, but this was life-changing. I got to get a life, I know, but it really was life-changing for me in the React world anyways. It was like, wow. Well, now any component anywhere down that tree, if it feels like it, just go grab that counter, the shared counter. Doesn't matter, just grab the counter. It's yours. You're good to go. That's it. That's how it works. So now log out. It's always 9, doesn't change. Look at that. With us. Yeah, I love this. I can do this all day. I seriously could. I need a life. Okay. All right. So shared state, super, super fun. Not that hard, right? It wasn't that hard. We had to build a provider. We had to, which kind of looks like a custom hook, you know, kind of, sort of. Just it's a component instead, has this funky little thing in it, and we had to have that context. Not that hard, and our value, which we had to have here, right? But apart from that, there's not a lot to it, and we could add anything you want. We could add maybe an Axios.get, like have a use effect, right? Have a use effect, which is going to import me really funny. Yeah, it does. Why does it do that? Put this here, there. Use effect, right? And do some stuff here, right? With maybe I've got my counters saved to a database, the initial counter, right? There, and I want to load the counter the first time my component loads. With an arrow there, right? So I do maybe an Axios.get counter, you know, whatever. Okay, it's saved to database, so I can every time. I don't have a trite example, but sure, no problem. Anything that deals with your counter or your state, put it here. Okay, all your stuff. If you've got an Axis, put it there. You've got a save, put it there. Like an Axios.save, put that there too. Put everything to do with your state in this provider, and then simply, yeah, just make yourself sure, you know, a save counter function there. Then anybody can save that counter wherever they are in your application. Okay. Yeah, I haven't got one, but I can make one. But sure. Okay. All right. So that's how they work. Now here's a couple of things to watch for. Okay. The most common one is this. You try to do a use context. Okay. But remember, we have to make sure that whatever component is doing use context, it must be wrapped. It has to be part of this nice warm blanket of our context. So if I didn't have that, let's say I didn't wrap those components in there, you're going to get a message that looks just like this. Object bracket dot dot something is undefined. Wholly unhelpful error message. If you dig a bit deeper, oh, look, it's happening on something doesn't make any sense, right? So it's not so great. It's really unhelpful, okay? Refresh a page, same thing, okay? Oh, now it's telling me, oh, the error is here. Okay, so a bit better clue. It's telling me the error is in my use context. That is because it wasn't wrapped. So if you see that message, it's a good indication that you did not wrap whatever is trying to do the use context in your context. So if I put those back there, it's going to be happy again. Okay, that's just one gotcha, or the one thing to watch out for when using use context. Okay, so right now I have no props. So now my app is calling my auth with only one prop. Let's go one step farther, shall we? Okay. Right now I'm sharing my counter. Let's do something more practical. Why don't we share the user, the current logged in user? Let's share that, but that's much more useful. Sharing a user object with everything in our application. Wow, that's cool, right? Let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to make ourselves another provider, and I'll copy this one because I hate typing, and they all look the same, really. I'm going to call it an auth provider, right? Oops. Auth. I could call it user provider too, but I'm kind of doing like login, log out, you know, auth. So I'm going to call it auth provider. Okay. Okay. So let's remove the stuff we don't need. So we're going to call this, let's just remove this. We don't need that because those are all specific to our counter. And let's empty that out. We don't need that there. So now we truly have an empty skeleton of a context provider, right? We don't change any of this stuff. We'll change the name, of course, but apart from that, it's all going to stay the same. Okay. Okay. So let's go ahead and add our stuff. Well, same thing. We have these functions. We have our user and two functions that operate on our user and our auth flag. I have my auth flag, logged in, yes, no, and then a user object. And I know I could have just used that as my auth flag, but I want to do two for fun. Okay, so let's grab all that state. Let's put that inside our provider, right there. There. Okay. Okay, now I have this state ready. Okay, so now I'm gonna expose those things. Well, I want to expose this, this, and this. What should I do? Well, put them right here. So auth, I want that to be available to everyone or whoever wants it. Maybe the current user, and maybe a login function and the logout function. There, good. And I'm going to rename this thing. I'm going to call it auth context. There, spell it right. And I'll call it my auth provider. There. And let's just take this and that and that. I think I'm done. I'm done. That was it. Wasn't that hard? So all I did was just change what's inside the sandwich, right? And I, of course, renamed these things to something more, makes more sense, right?
There's one more.
We got one more?
bottom
Wherever got
At
it,
the
let's take a look.
bottom
Oh,
where
yeah,
it
you're
has
right.
text for
Ah,
debug.
yeah, you're totally right. Totally right. Yes, thank you for that. I'd noticed that pretty fast when it crashes on me. All right. Sharp crowd today. Okay. Okay. Great. So not many changes, just copy and paste my state, right? Once again, when you're managing state in React, try to keep things together. So keep the state and the functions that make direct changes to that state, keep them all as a unit. Remember we had this thing called use application data? That was its job, was to manage state. You have some state and some functions that change the state. So other people simply call those functions. Same thing. Nothing in our application is going to modify auth directly. It's going to call probably something else. Well, it's going to call login and log out, right? Which will in turn log in. Now, as you can see, my login is pretty insecure. It just says auth true. So I don't check anything. You might have maybe some kind of Axios.get, login post something, right? And maybe I'll have my login function take a username password, right? Which I do here, right? But I'm not doing that right now, okay? So, but I could make this more complex. But ultimately, its end goal is to do what? Is to set the user and the auth. So this could be a whole bunch of code, but at the end of the day, all it does is set those two things, right? Yes, no, and user null or not. It's simple, right? So, okay. And my logout function, all it does is, well, nothing. It may do an Axios call if I need to tell my system that this user's logged out now, perhaps, or not, or I just clear them. I'm just clearing them here. And that's all that happened. So as we can see in my app, it's simply using this auth as my flag for which page to render, right? Okay. All right, so we got a context. Let's go ahead and use our context now. I don't think there's nothing else needed. Yeah, it was pretty easy. Okay, let's go ahead and use our auth provider so we have access to the auth context. So let's go into our app.js. So we have all this stuff. So instead of using this, let's go ahead, actually go to our info page. Let's go info, a simpler one. This one here. Okay, so there's my, it's getting props and it's calling props.login. I think that's all it needs actually. Yeah, that's all it needs. So my login page, it only needs the login function. It doesn't use anything else out of my auth, just login. So it calls login. So why don't I, instead of that, I'm going to go ahead and grab my login from my context, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and import my context. So I'm going to say import my auth context. From that, great, okay. And then I'm going to go ahead and say const login equals use context. And I'm going to use that auth context. Let's import this right there as we have it. Okay, great. Okay.
The context is misspelled, the use context.
You're probably right. Oh, yeah, use context. You're totally right. Let's use context. Yeah, good old copy and paste. Okay. There. Okay. Oh, one more context. Oh, of course. Hold
on. The use
context. Yeah, use context. Yeah. I got counters on my brain. So
I think the extra U is
Good.
also in the provider file. So
Ah, wow, that was fun. Okay, oh, and let's just use this like that. Okay. Okay, well now I'm getting another interesting error, aren't I? This is all correct, right? Use context, but I've got this error. We've seen this before, haven't we? We've seen this error on use context. What
It's
is that
because
telling me?
we didn't wrap the component in the context, right? The
That's
context
right.
provider.
That's right. We didn't wrap our component, and our component that's doing this one is it's this one, right? So we want to wrap everything here. Let's go ahead and wrap our, we'll do it this. This is only temporary. We'll do this way. So let's go ahead and wrap our auth provider here. There. Let's take that and do that. Okay, so now it seems like it's happy, okay? All right. So now I can go ahead into my login and remove all the other stuff. It doesn't need to have anything else. It needs to just call login now. There, okay. And now props is probably unused. It's not used, so that props, okay? There we go. Now it's not gonna work because what's happening is I'm setting, see, it's not working. Why is that? That's because I'm looking at this auth here, aren't I? So my rendering is being affected by this auth, whereas my login page is affecting this auth. So what I have to do now is I have to have my app. Let's first go ahead and clean up our info page. We'll do the same thing with our info page. Let's go to our info page first. We'll do the same thing, exactly the same. So we're going to go ahead and grab all the stuff. I'll copy and paste so I don't, there. I don't misspell anything again. There we go. And into our login page, we're also going to, I'll grab this one for now. There. Okay, great. And we don't use state. And now I'm going to have my info page do the same thing. It's also going to use that context. So grab that out of our login page, just like that. Okay. Okay. And now it's going to, instead of log, I'm going to have it use logout because it needs logout, my page. It also needs my user. There. So there we go. Okay, so now my info page is also getting no props, and it can grab directly the user and the logout because that's what the page needs, right? It needs a logout button and the current user. But still, nothing is happening, and that's because my app still has this state here, doesn't it? It still has this state. So I need to use my use context here. So let's try the same thing. Let's go ahead and go in our app and do the same thing. So grab that provider, get the context, and we're going to import the provider. And then we'll import use context. There. There we go. And then we'll use our context that we just imported. Okay. Let's go into here and we'll grab our auth and our user, or just our auth, I guess. Do we need user? Actually, we don't need user, do we? In fact, now these aren't needed anymore, are they? There. Oops, hold on. We need the login, but no props to login. There. And no props to our other page. Okay. So the only thing we need here really is just this auth thing. Okay, so there. We need this auth, right? Things are still working, but this auth is not the auth inside our. So let's go ahead, instead of that, we're going to say const auth equals our use context of our auth context. Okay. Oh, and we're getting this error again. Ah, I told you guys this is a one that gets it sometimes. So what's it telling me that I've done wrong? Okay. I've wrapped my components, haven't I? There it is. I'm wrapping things in this auth provider, but clearly React thinks I haven't. What have I done wrong? Let's think about what we're doing here. I'm calling use context here, aren't I? This is being called inside which component?
Oh, it is this is the component that's
Yeah,
the
this is the
children
app.
list
Yeah,
component
this is
is
the
the
app
component.
component.
Oh, okay.
This is the app component. I'm wrapping my children, but I need to wrap myself, right?
Can you just wrap outside the div?
Ah,
The
well,
auth
I
writer?
could do this maybe here, and that's certainly illegal. Same problem. What I really want is this, right? This is what I want. I want this. There. We actually want to have our whole app wrapped in auth provider. You have to, right? In order for use context to work, you have to wrap. But I can't do this. It's an error, right? Conceptually, this is what I want, right? Conceptually, okay? It doesn't work. It's totally useless. But this, so how can I achieve this though? This is what I want to have. How can I achieve this?
Oh,
Is there a props.parent somehow, which we are not?
Well, we could. Let's think about how, good. That's great though, yeah. Let's think about how React applications actually work. React apps, okay? Let's go back to the anatomy of a React app, okay? What do we have in a React app? Okay, we have our index.html, right? This, has our little thing here with our little container. That's fine, okay? Doesn't really help us. We have another file that we almost never look at.
the
Index.js. Oh, look at that. There's our app right there. Ah, okay. Anyone have an idea what we can do now?
Do we just move
Why
the
don't
auth?
we? Yeah. Why not simply wrap it here? Let's go ahead and try that. So let's just grab our context and our provider here and put it right inside our index. It's JavaScript. No one says we can't do that, right? It's just JavaScript. Now we can wrap our app in. Let's try that. Wrap our whole app inside our auth provider. So we're going to wrap our app in our provider, and now our app can go ahead and grab the context and use it. Now it's happy. Okay, cool. And no use state anymore. No need for state. Great. So now I've wrapped my whole app in this authentication provider. Okay, the whole thing. Which means, of course, now any component anywhere in the app has direct access to my user and my auth flag if I want, and all the functions that comes with that. Let's make sure this works now. There's my app, so no props. I'm just got the auth. Let's try and log in. Oh, it's working. So that state is being shared. Log out, log in, and we have our counter. So now what we have here, we have an application. Let's double check with, there's our login there, and there's our info. So yeah, we have an application with absolutely no props at all in the entire app. It's a prop-free application. Yay. Okay, so the trick we used was to do this, right? We wrap the whole thing in app. Now, we don't often do this, except for something that's like really important, like maybe the auth, the user might be, okay? Normally you put them down a little lower. And you can have as many of these as you want. Now, don't go nuts with providers. Like, make maybe a state provider that provides all your state and have some different arrays and stuff and some access against each one of them. I would not recommend that you did what Compass does in your final project and have a state object with a whole bunch of stuff in it. Turns out that's not the way you do things anymore. So do not make complex state objects. We also did it because we're teaching you things like immutable data update patterns, and we would have denied you the pleasure of writing update spots, which was lots of fun. So we did that so you could have the great fun of writing update spots, which is triple immutability on a set state. So, but in reality, don't do that. You want 2 states, then make 2 states. Just make 2 of them. You got 3, make 3. Okay. Don't make complex state structure. And this is the official line now from React. They say this: do not build complex state objects. Okay. Okay. So then it becomes easy, right? Our updates become super simple, like the set user, right there, set user, not set state state comma user, right? Now it has its place, and you may have some stuff, but where possible, just don't do it. Just keep your state nice and flat, and we'll all be happy. It's inside a provider. It's all nice and self-contained here and manageable. It's not being, passed around as an object anymore. So it's great. You don't have to pass a state object. Another reason we had it, of course, because we had to pass a state thing all the way around. Got kind of complicated. Okay, so this stuff is great. It is really cool. It really super simplifies your usage of state in an application, and there's no Redux. And by the way, this is exactly what Redux does, is this. They use context with the provider. That's Redux. That's what they do. They do behind the covers, but that's it. There's no difference between what this does and what Redux does. Redux has more features and a lot of other stuff, and like really cool optimizations that prevent re-rendering, all kinds of cool things. But for the most part, it does the same thing. And this is pretty simple. Like, put your state, wrap it in a sandwich, and then do your import and your use context, and you're good to go. And you can choose whatever you want. Maybe I want to have also the count, or I want to grab maybe the auth flag. Sure, I grab that too if I need it. You can choose what you choose to use. So you can import lots of things or export many things from your provider, but your components will only use what they need out of it, right? Okay. A couple of things. Now, the question is sometimes, this sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? Who thinks that, right? Oh, you got your hand up there? I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, so
You're too polite. You're way too polite.
yeah, a little bit, but would it be common or considered a good practice to have a generic state provider where all of state is in it? Or
Great question. And since we have time, if you guys have a couple minutes more, I will talk about that. Yes, that would not be a bad idea. In fact, I've got one of those. I'll show in a second. But yes, excellent idea. Because you don't have these things can get, as you can see, it can get kind of nuts, like wrap and a wrap and a wrap and a wrap. That can get crazy, right? Now, strictly, you can actually, technically speaking, you could wrap a provider in another provider, right? Which we've done here. But it still gets kind of complex, right? You could put a provider here. I could actually put inside my auth provider, I could put a counter provider, right? I could put a counter provider. Well, I could if I could spell it, but I could, right? But I won't. Don't want to go too crazy, right? So keep it as flat as possible.
So in that situation where, for example, we have a generic state provider, does it mean we need to wrap it always at the outermost level so that everybody will have access to it? Because
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's not a problem, right?
Yeah. Whatever components you want to have access to your state, make sure they are wrapped. So make sure you follow this pattern. As long as it's wrapped, has access. Now, you might not need to wrap app. We can always just make another component called pages and you're good to go, right? Then all the pages have access. I did it just to demonstrate that we can also put things in index.js.
Yeah.
And by the way, yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to ask that, for example, now we have 2, right? One is auth, needs to be wrapped outside of app. The other one is counter. Then let's say, for example, we have a bunch of them, right? They all kind of have their own little.
Put them in one provider.
Yeah.
Yes, just like was mentioned before, we could put them all in one big provider. We certainly
So
could.
when we put them into one, then they need to kind of cover everything. Then the only choice is we have to wrap everything outside of app.
Everything that needs access to it. But if app doesn't need it, you don't need it, right? If app doesn't need it, like app didn't need my counter, did it? It just needed, see, it didn't need counter, just underneath. So you don't need to wrap app all the time, unless you have something that really needs to be accessed in this part of app, right? Because once I'm in here, all the components below this have access to it. And app is usually pretty small. We try not to put a lot of stuff in your app, right? Not too much stuff, okay? You can, but not as, keep it as clean as possible. In fact, in general, components should be clean anyways, but you want it to be as clean as possible, okay? So it is too good to be true. There's a couple of little gotchas, not a big deal. One of them is this. These are components, right? A provider is a component, isn't it? There it is. It's a component. A function returns JSX, it's a component. So inside this component, I'm setting state, aren't I? Right? So thinking back to our first React lecture, or maybe second one. What happens to a component when you change its state?
It
What does it do?
re-renders.
Oh, yes. Wow, you guys are sharp. Yes, it re-renders. What does that mean, re-render? Nice word. What does it mean?
It means the portion is gonna have to reload, right? And it's gonna take time.
Well, technically it means this is a function, isn't it?
Oh, it's gonna get called again.
What do we do with functions? Yeah. What's the only thing we can do with functions? We can call them. That's it. So it's going to call the whole function again. Set state. It calls all over again that thing. What does that mean? Well, then it calls this, which means all of its children also re-render, right? Which means in my app re-renders, my login re-renders, right? And inside it, all of its components and all their children, they all re-render, okay? Sounds hugely inefficient. It's not that bad. For small, medium applications, doesn't matter. Because as we know, JavaScript can process, 50,000 objects in the time it takes to change one O on the screen. It's unbelievably fast, okay? There are ways to get around that, optimizations you can add. And that's what Redux does. Things like memoizing components, right? We haven't talked about use memo before. That allows a component to not render unless it actually needs to change its stuff. It doesn't render again. You can do these things. We haven't done that here, okay? So ours is somewhat inefficient. So if you've got a large application, and we're talking like, thousands of components, right? For final projects, a couple hundred components, don't even worry about it. It's not going to be an issue. Just be aware that when you do render something, it will render all of its children. It's a ripple effect, and they all get re-rendered. Right now, it's virtual DOM. Nothing flickers on the screen because it's all virtual, and only things that change actually get rendered on the or painted on the browser. Okay, so we do add optimizations for things that re-render a lot. Okay, things like use memo, and there's some other tricks we can do as well. So Redux does that for you, or you get part of that done for free with Redux. Okay, but honestly, this, and people have said this has just killed Redux. There's almost, I won't say it too loudly because people get upset with me, has almost made Redux obsolete. Not quite true. There's use for Redux, but really for medium applications, which is less than a couple thousand components, this works perfectly fine. Okay. It also becomes extremely useful when using React Router, because now you don't have to worry about those props inside your link statements, like, oh, what's all that? Yeah, so no, just wrap it and you're good to go. Grab the state. Okay, so that's our talk on use context. It's pretty cool. It's really, really fun stuff.